talks, which there will be 3 of those throughout this week. And they are just a way of trying to find out whether there is the possibility of cultivating a common agenda for the countries around the Mediterranean, a common design agenda. So we're very happy to have Professor Mona FAWAZ with us today for that, for our first Mediterranean talks. Let me, before I pass the moderation of this session to Kıvanç, KILINÇ, I just want to explain a few technical matters. So the event is live both on Zoom and also on YouTube. So you can watch that on YouTube as well. It will be held in English. Should you wish to follow in Turkish, you can use the interpretation function down on the right-hand side. If you click on interpretation, 2 options will appear. One of them is English. The other one is Korean. For Turkish translation, please choose Korean. For some reason, that came up. If you would like to pose a question, you can use the Q&A option down below. The chat will stay open on the right-hand side. If you have a comment, if you want to share something with the listeners, you can do so. But for the questions, please choose the Q&A option. And we might be making some, well, explanations on the chat box as well. You might want to follow up on that. This part also in Turkish. Eğer bu yayını Türkçe dinlemek isterseniz aşağıdaki interpretation seçeneğini kullanıp Türkçe, Korece seçeneğini seçip Türkçe olarak bu yayını takip edebilirsiniz. Yes, that's all I have to say. I'm just now passing the floor to Kıvanç, KILINÇ. Thanks very much again for being with us. I'll be on the background. Thanks for this talk.
Thank you, Emre. I hope everybody can hear me well. Welcome all. My guest today is Mona FAWAZ. I'm here with my editorial head today, but actually with colleagues at American University of Beirut's Architecture and Design Department. The title of our conversation today is Affordable Housing, Inclusive Cities, Designing Common Futures from Beirut to the Mediterranean Dream. Muna, ehle ve sahla, hoş geldiniz. Aramıza katılarak bizi onurlandırdığınız için teşekkür ediyoruz. Şükran kثير. نحن مبسوطين لحضورك معنا اليوم. شرفتينا. We're honored to have you here for the first talk in the Mediterranean talk series.
Hi, Kıvanç, and thank you so much for having me and for including me in these talks. I'm really looking forward to the discussion, and thank you for this warm welcome in 3 languages. I love it.
I did my best, I guess.
Oh no, that is you could easily go for a local.
Okay, thank you. It's great to hear that. So, well, before, let me introduce you to the participants, colleagues, and friends watching this talk. Well, it's difficult to describe your work in a few sentences, but I'll give it a try. Mona FAWAZ is a professor in urban studies and planning and co-founder and research director at the Beirut Urban Lab at the American University of Beirut. Her scholarly interests stem from the imperative of making cities more inclusive, particularly from the perspective of enabling low-income dwellers to take part in shaping their cities. Her work spans across urban history and historiography, social and spatial justice, informality and the law, property and space, as well as planning practice, theory, and pedagogy. FAWAZ has authored over 50 scholarly articles, book sections, and reports in Arabic, French, and English. She is currently working on an alternative history of Beirut, a project that aims to critically engage scholarship about the city's history in its post-independence period and propose an alternative narrative built from the standpoint of urban territories. She's also the founder and coordinator of the Social Justice and the City program at the FAWAZ Institute. She holds a BArch from AUB, a master's in city and regional planning, and PhD from the Department of Urban Studies and Planning at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT. Welcome again, Muna. I'm very honored to have you here. Really, I'm very excited that we're talking, having this conversation. Emre explained the format a little bit, so I'll only say that we'll be taking about 45-50 minutes, ideally, both of us, and then we'll open the floor to questions from the audience, about 15-20 more minutes. And that will be the end of our conversation. So let me begin with my first question. And also thanks to Emre Gönlügür for contributing to these questions as well. Before I forget, really appreciate it. So you are co-founder and research director at the Beirut Urban Lab. Can you please tell us a bit about this collaborative and interdisciplinary research hub? What kind of research do you do and your colleagues carry out there, and what is the importance of developing and circulating common sense judgments about urban issues based on collaborative research? And my question, second question relating to this same question is around Urban Lab, is your current work related to the nationwide recovery efforts following the blast in Beirut, which happened early August, as most of us, or all of us surely know about or have heard about. In what different ways have you put your expertise as a team and the research carried at the lab to the service of the communities and neighborhoods in need? And are you collaborating with other initiatives and organizations? So sorry about the long question, but I'll be happy to remind you if you. Thank you.
Yeah, I may need that. Thank you. Well, thanks again for the invite and for the engagement. I think the idea of the lab really builds on that interest that you and so many of us have today in this moment of our global history to reclaim a way in which knowledge needs to be produced in very grounded form, to be able to contribute meaningfully to the context in which one lives. At the same time, there's a global realization that we're all subjected to many of the same general trends across the globe. I mean, if we compare Beirut to Istanbul or Izmir, we know that the cities have been devastated by some of the same public policies that have affected numerous other cities also around the world. These policies travel and with international organizations, they travel with foreign consultants, and they end up materializing in the same way of same kind of recipes. And at the same time, we feel that we also need to be sharing as recipient of these policies, ways of looking at things, of understanding things, and potentially contributing to make our cities better. So if you look around the work that we have on our website, you'll see that the lab is only 2 years old, and yet the work is like 15 years old. This is because the lab brings together myself, but also, as you know, my colleagues, Professor Mona Harib, Huwaid Al-Harithi, and Ahmed Gharbiye. And the four of us have been finding ourselves from our disciplines as urban historians, urban designers, graphic designers, political scientists, interested in the urban and interested in contributing to the context in which we live, and naturally collaborating to find answers and meaningful explanations to the city in which we are. I can speak of projects as diverse as those that have mapped the transfer of property ownership along Beirut's coast and ways in which one should contribute to it, to mapping security mechanisms in Beirut, which means all the elements of militarized security which you've lived in Beirut, the normalization of a tank and a checkpoint in people's everyday lives, and its different implication for different people that have led us to produce one type of mapping, and on the other hand, other kinds of mappings that try to reclaim a role, for example, for refugees in Beirut as city makers, very much in line with Istanbul. And we really have even a chapter in that work about the issue of refugees as city makers in which we seek to again reclaim a role for refugees in the making of the city. They all come together in a way to speak from Beirut about urban processes that we believe are very much in parallel with other urban contexts. And as such, we see the lab as a collaborative space, as an interdisciplinary space that both produces scholarship on urbanization by documenting, analyzing, but also intervenes as an interlocutor and a contributor to a more global conversation about the history of urbanization. We think this is important because it helps us and others understand the context in which we are and also affect it. Of course, when I say it only started 2 years ago, this is a long-term vision. This is a dream that we talked about many times and we tried to see materialize. So being able to finally get that grant that allows you to reclaim a space from the university, set up your website, collect all the work, try to put it up, has been incredibly empowering and really a wonderful moment. So really, this is sort of the lab in many, many words. You've also asked me about how we're contributing right now to the post-disaster
if you've been
recovery.
able to, your expertise, your experience in the last 2 years and more. And I mean, I'm sure you're now all busy with the efforts recovery. I mean, the efforts to sort of relieve the communities from the effects of the blast. And I know that at the Urban Lab, you did projects that involved mapping and the data collecting, but also very particular things that are addressing particular neighborhoods and their needs and advocacy and activism. So that's what I'm curious to hear. And what
Sure. So actually, our first big collaboration, the four of us, happened in 2006, following the Israel war on Lebanon, in which we found ourselves naturally going to the neighborhoods that were devastated and trying to see ways in which we could put our expertise at the service of communities that had been affected by the blast. We dreamt at that moment to put in place what was a nascent understanding of post-disaster recovery that looks at not simply returning neighborhoods to where they were because they never started in a place that you aspire to, but rather engaging residents in conversations so that we can set the neighborhoods in a process of urbanization that would be more inclusive and achieve higher levels of livability for these districts. So naturally, the August 4 blast created that sense of emergency again for us. And at that point, for me specifically, having been mapping for 2 years the effect of financialization on the city and the extent to which population's presence in Beirut, many population groups' presence in Beirut, had been rendered fragile by the influx of capital, I wanted not only to contribute in mapping the effects of the blast, but in demonstrating the extent to which the blast perpetuates or exacerbates what was already in place. And so we rushed to map, but also to use our knowledge to warn that the disaster can be, the blast can be really a moment to intensify disaster capitalism that was already materializing in Lebanon, displace people permanently, accelerate the loss of heritage, culture, and people's livelihoods in the city. So we've been doing this since August 4, almost nonstop. We've been mapping the effects of the blast. We've been trying to generate conversations among scholars and residents and activists in the country about the effects of the blast. And we've also, with Huwaida's work particularly, been working out of a neighborhood in Beirut, actually one of the poorest, most vulnerable, Karantina, from where an exercise of bringing residents together, mobilizing them, forming neighborhood committees, and drawing long-term visions for what the neighborhood should be are being set in place. And we're then engaging the UN organizations and local NGOs to turn the ideas and aspirations of residents into actual projects and interventions that will create a different process of recovery. So that's in a lot of words.
Thank you. No, I mean, we don't have enough time and space for you to give us any detail of what you've been doing and the magnitude of this. I mean, it's immense. I really appreciate whatever you have been doing and you're planning to do. And you mentioned that this kind of happened on top of what was already in place. So about what was already in place takes me to my second question. And let's I mean, for us, for our audience too, about the history of urban development in Beirut, especially following the end of the Civil War, 1989, 1990, and the Taif Agreement. The city's urban scene since have witnessed privatization of large chunks of public spaces and their loss, and as well as reconstruction, right, of the downtown area, especially to kind of reclaim those spaces, to attract international tourism and investment from the Gulf, especially, I guess. And then there's this Solidaire, this kind of government joint company that played a big role in this transformation in the last 3 decades. So can you tell us how in the spheres of first, decision-making processes and participation, and second, affordable housing and the housing question and problem in general, and urban heritage conversation as the third, beat these policies, these developments and transformations, shape the contemporary moments in Beirut and Lebanon at large? I mean, aside from the blast, or even let's go to the moment one day before the blast, right? And I'm including in the contemporary moments, Tavra, revolution, the mass demonstrations and social unrest that started last October and has since been going on in different ways. So how all these kind of fed into the contemporary moment and the kind of mess it is, I guess, from my own experience of how did we come to this point?
Yes. So, I mean, if I go back to 1990 and the end of the Lebanese Civil War, it's important to remember that the Lebanese Civil War ended when the warlords basically allied with a small clique of businessmen who paid them off to bring them on board. And they traded their military fatigues in business suits, in high-end European designer business suits. And so then we started that phase that some people may want to call capitalism, but which is really socialism, where the benefits are redistributed, but consistently to a very small clique of people who are very rich. And over the last 30 years, they have transformed the city and all its assets, including its port, including its urban fabric, including its historic core, into ways in which they can accumulate profit for the very few. And that vision rests on a notion that you can, rather than allowing the city to be to its potential, a place where people can live in, work in, enjoy, identify their culture, they basically transformed it into a resource. And what you do is you sell pieces of this resource to other well-off people who will use it to store their wealth. And gradually, first in the historic core, and then expanding to the neighborhoods, including the neighborhoods in which the blast occurred, we ended up with a city where a lot of the land, a lot of the built fabric was being used to attract capital and to store capital, while the use value of that place, even as a workplace, was being evacuated. So again, that is not a supply-demand kind of natural trend that capitalism sets in place. This is public policy. This is public financialization policy, where the central bank puts in partnership with parliament and government policies to attract money into the built environment. And so the built environment loses that capability it has to be a place of work or a place of livelihood, including affordable housing, which does not figure at all in the scheme of public policy making. And instead, what you end up with is a scheme in which more and more vacancies are all over the city. And by vacancies, I mean apartments that are not inhabited. I mean buildings where all the residents have been evicted and then they stand empty and no one lives in them. They're awaiting demolition and replacement by higher end buildings. What is interesting is that when the new buildings are built, very often they're at least half the apartments are not inhabited. They're kept empty. So you have to imagine that they're like safety deposit boxes, right? This is where people store wealth. And you keep it there because it's safer than the banks. And what this produces ultimately is a city that loses its ability to house people. Victims include, of course, low-income city dwellers who wanted to live in that city and who now are forced to leave to the suburbs to commute for hours when they have to work, but also the city's culture, its heritage, because when you've created an investment environment in which what we call the rent gap, which is the difference between how much money you can wrap from a building right now and how much you can potentially wrap if you demolish it and build a tower in its place. When that rent gap is so big, it means everything that was built when there were restrictions on building heights or when building construction technologies made you build 2 or 3 floors is going to be demolished. And this is really what you see in Beirut. So loss of heritage, and also really betting people against this heritage. Because if I'm a property owner and I don't get state subsidies and there's no support for me in restoring an old building and the materials are expensive and that building is inhabited by an older person who's on rent control, who barely pays me anything, ultimately all I'm dreaming of is to find a way to demolish that building. And so the entire economy was set towards the destruction of heritage, the displacement of people. That was the model. The problem, the biggest problem in this model is, again, that it continues to concentrate wealth with a handful of developers who are at the same time bankers and members of the political class. So they are actually able to design the policies that serve their interest. The model continued to work with a fiction that it was really very profitable to invest in real estate in Beirut. It was really very profitable to place your money in banks in Lebanon. And that fiction, that story, continued to sort of operate until early 2019, when more and more voices began to say, this is insane. How, at a time when even New York's best banks don't give you 1% interest on your money, the Lebanese banks are giving you 11 and 16%. How can it be that an apartment in Beirut can cost more than an apartment in Marseille for the same size, when Marseille gives you, as you know, 24-hour electricity, 24 hours water, access to public transportation, access to public healthcare and public schools? Beirut gives you none of this. So how can that be? And when the contradictions of that system became clearer and clearer, and well-off people began to realize that the system is getting to its logical end and began to pull out their money and send them abroad, that began to create a panic, followed by a bank run, which accompanied that time when people went on the street, because the way in which the government imagined it could recover the money was by taxing the same people again. And so that was the Thawra. It was a moment in which people said, enough is enough, your model doesn't work. That model set in place in 1990 at the end of the Lebanese Civil War is not a model for people. We can no longer take it. And so there's been this aspiration to replace it, to build an alternative, which we continue to live now, amidst, of course, one of the most difficult moments in any country's history, because that financial meltdown ended up with Lebanon defaulting on its foreign debts, meaning no more foreign money coming in the country. It also coincides with the COVID crisis, so everyone's poor, no one can really send you money. And of course, eventually the port blast and a massive political crisis, which we continue to live until now. So that's today's moment.
Yeah, it's a pretty grim picture, obviously, and the lived reality. And it's been, I mean, I get accumulating and getting worse. I mean, it's weight on the people, on the regular people in Lebanon in general. But I guess if we go back to the question of the models, you know, that the model adopted in the 1990s, let me, you know, open up a little bit that question beyond the borders of Lebanon, if I may. So, it's a well-known story now that from the 80s on, states have adopted neoliberal economic policies, and in the urban sphere, the effects have been privatization, ghettoization, fragmentation, gentrification, all those words that we're familiar with. They also retreated from producing affordable housing, right, directly or indirectly. And in our region, for instance, unregulated housing markets left masses of people vulnerable, and informal settlements kind of replaced them or have expanded, in terrible condition. Added to that, refugee neighborhoods and camps. So in line with these developments, for the last couple of decades or so, we're led to believe that housing provision is a self-regulating mechanism, that we're on our own now to kind of securing it for ourselves, right? So it's not nobody's job, like the states or the local administration. So a discourse built around housing as a service rather than a basic right or a duty for the states to do. So how can we challenge this understanding? I mean, what would be the role of and potential of collective action across the region, dismantling this kind of mindsetting and ideology, and how would that eventually reflect on how we build and rebuild our cities? I know it's a big question, but
no, it's absolutely spot on. It should be the project. Housing is a right, and everywhere around the world, in our region and beyond, people are reclaiming housing as a right and rejecting what has been set in place. In some countries like Lebanon and many others, the intertwined effects of neoliberalism with corrupt political classes have produced very skewed scenarios. But irrespective of the specificities of the Lebanese scenario, globally, we are getting towards the end of a model. And we are seeing people refusing that model. So those who were willing to play the role of housing loans and to try and borrow money so that we accept that if you are not able, you can be disciplined by the rules of the market by getting a loan that will enable you to become a homeowner, are also finding themselves right now unable to pay the loans in much more fragile conditions. And that is also means the model doesn't work. What do we do? Well, I find hope in some of the policies that were set in place in Brazil, for example, following the democratization of the government, where the social value of land was considered a priority in the constitution. That's a principle that then requires national government to translate planning tools in ways that recover housing as a right and recover urban space as a place in which one can has to live. And so it translates, for example, at the very simple level in fighting vacancies. In Lebanon today, that's the case I know best, if you keep an apartment empty, you are exempted from taxes altogether. So it's not only that I tax you over it, the law says, oh, you're not living in it, so don't pay municipal tax, don't pay property tax, which means I give you an incentive as a speculator to keep that house, to keep it empty. And what we're saying is, if you look at what Barcelona just did, if you look at what Paris did, if you look at what Berlin did in the last 3-4 years, they are not only introducing taxes, but they're also introducing exponential taxes. So if you keep that apartment empty, you're going to be taxed, and you're going to be taxed hefty. And so you have every incentive to basically inhabit that house or rent it out. And that creates a framework. The other framework that is quite successful is to recognize that cities need stocks of affordable housing. And because my friends often, when I say this, think that I'm a crazy socialist, maybe I am, but the United States does that, right? So I mean, if the US requires that every state and every city creates a set of affordable housing and uses affordable housing tools in order to incentivize that, surely we can do it. And here you can think of market-based tools at some level, like inclusionary housing, where developers no longer build homes in cities simply because they are building and we should give them the red carpet, but actually through negotiations in which developers return something to cities when they're allowed to build. And that something they return can be either funding to build affordable housing, or it can be affordable housing units. So these are achievements that were done by social movements. I can talk also of zones of special social interest that were adopted in several countries in Latin America, where areas like informal settlements are not demolished, but rather rehabilitated with restrictions on land sales to allow residents on the long run to stay there. And so you avoid the Turkey scenario of using that opportunity of rehabilitation to displace low-income people and create high-end developments under the guise of providing affordable housing, by saying, no, you have to keep people in place. And so once you do that, what you're doing is you're extracting from the market areas of the city that municipal authorities can keep, maintain, and keep below market value and organize access based on needs so that at least sections or pockets of the city remain affordable areas. The main challenge in all of this is political will. It's not difficult, it doesn't cost money, it costs political will. And our main crisis in the region is democracy, because when our local authorities do not represent us, then they have no incentive to create the kind of policies that respond to this kind of need. That's why I feel that the real hope right now is in municipal politics. If we can begin to at least create local authorities, and here we have a ray of hope across the region, right, and beyond. If we can begin to elect local authorities that have residents at heart, that seek to actually recognize or recover at least some of the value of cities as lived places, then there is hope for change. And in that sense, and it's going to sound completely insane, I think we're at a great moment in Lebanon, because at least we have come to recognize that the model we set in place is unlivable and we have to change it.
Thank you. I guess we're having similar feelings about the new wave of mayors elected in the last few years in Turkey, and the change that happened together with them, and that's people empowering them basically, rather than there being single actors in this process. Again, you ended up with the a more positive note, so I want to take it to a more so I'm going to push for more negativity to come from you. I don't want it to happen that way, but I mean, let me ask the question nevertheless. And what I want to ask you now is related to the broader theme of this event, the broader theme of good design Izmir this year. So in a region, right, where people live within a harsh reality of humanitarian and economic crises, unending regional conflicts and wars and proxy wars, right? And a region which is often portrayed in the international media as kind of patchwork of fragmented communities who don't really want to live together, or who are ruled by illiberal governments and continuously fight and struggle over power and identity and other things. I mean, where do we begin our talk for building common futures, right? For instance, could we talk about larger environmental, humanitarian issues that connect us across the Mediterranean? And what can we do as urbanists, architects, designers, artists, students, or simply as concerned citizens, right? To strengthen the ties between our cities and initiatives and struggles.
Lovely. I'm going to try to be contagiously optimistic despite everything. First, let me say that every time someone tells me that the Middle East or the region is desperately in violence and wars, I said, yes, that's true. But if you go back 150 years ago, maybe it was not that way. To the contrary, there was more diversity. So for Lebanon, for example, the project of sectarian citizenship is a European modern project of classifying populations in ways that respond to the clear-cut categories that were needed at the time by the Europeans. It does not correspond to a local representation. And in that sense, I do not think there's anything historically inevitable about our region or our world. There's certainly something inevitably crazy about humanity and the way it's addressing climate change. That it's difficult to find a ray of hope there. The way in which we're dealing with the climate crisis globally is just denial. And that makes me think that it would be really difficult to get people to feel that we are united in our humanity to save the planet. I think that where, as an urbanist, I can find hope, and I can see a way in which things can be more positive, is in beginning to recreate and reinvent shared collectivities at local scales and perhaps potentially eventually beyond. But there is an effort that has to happen at a local scale, in which collectivities, people begin to identify as a we that defies the classifications of modernity along national citizenship, along sectarian citizenship that we have seen in the last 100 decades. And to do that, I really think our professions are amazing. We are bringing people around a shared geography, a shared lived space. And we are asking people to imagine ways in which they can imagine their futures together in that place. And that's where I find the potential of particularly city planning to be extremely powerful. So if you think of city planning in its modern dimension of the 1950s, developing master plans in top-down form to tell people how they should live, you find a very regressive profession that sort of used science to serve particular political interests and produced a very dark reality across the board. But if you look at planning in its promise of pushing people to think about the collective places in which they live together, if you take that to be a capability to design visioning exercises that encourage people to collaborate at multiple scales, because they have to share a shared geography, shared resources like water, like land, then you begin to see that there are possibilities of devising shared imaginaries around real things. And I think this is really what we need. The earlier political projects that we've seen in the region, and certainly beyond, are very powerful in telling us what doesn't work. And right, we're architects, we're trying to do that. We go to places and we just critique, and we tell the students why their projects don't work, and we tell why their project is bad, and we excel at criticism. But the challenge is to go beyond that criticism and to offer people a place in which they can assemble, a place in which they can stand together and say, yes, we identify as a collective this way. Fantastic experience in this poll experiment we did it back in 2015, 2016, with the municipal movement that we ran in Beirut, around Beirut Medinati. We started saying we are going to defy the ruling powers by precisely offering those visions of what Beirut can be. And you had so many architects, illustrators who started simply drawing what the public beach would be if we closed down the resorts and we recovered it, what the public park of the city would be like if it was open and we stopped making people be afraid to use it, because they will kill each other if they're in the same space, right? So all these images allowed people to imagine a possible alternative. And I think this is the potential of planning, not to tell them what they should be, but to really be able to collectively imagine a different possibility. So there, I think this is where we have to play a role, and we have to play a role in going beyond our little niches to learn from each other's experiences and create those direly needed networks that allow us to learn from each other's lessons and experiences, import ideas. I find a lot of hope when I look at some of the experiments that have happened in Colombia or in Brazil. And I think we ought to continue doing that, even if no example is perfect.
Yeah, thank you for this answer, really, that you're ending in this positive note. And let me elaborate on that. And I mean, thinking of the cities around the Mediterranean. And if I would like to, this is my last question, I would like to end our conversation with a more personal note. And this is going to be my longest question, so bear with me. And if you don't mind, I'd like to very briefly share with you passages from a text I wrote a few years back on Beirut first, and then I'll continue. Here it goes. I have grown a certain likeness toward you, toward the way in which you bring all these impossible words together. The ease with which you accept me with all I know and remember. The sadness that lurks behind every wild tree. the people minding their own businesses. My everyday amazement at you and my utmost familiarity with your power cuts, generator fumes, broken sidewalks, laughs, cries, curses, and sighs. A city where the most ordinary of streets are the most laden with secrets. I wander, but to no avail. I frequent places, but they're floating. We are on a ship, we walk on the sea. The truth is hard to capture, perhaps because it's useless. You are the lovers that have never been. You are all the people who happen to be here at once, whose shadows are cast on all of us. When one thinks of Beirut, Izmir, Selanik, Thessaloniki, and other cities around the Mediterranean, one would immediately think of their warm climate and outgoing lifestyles of friendly people, unorderly streets, to say the least, shared taste of food and music, and of course, their complicated historical and imperial heritage. So they're similar, to my own experience, but also quite different. And one cannot shake off the feeling, walking through the streets, that strange feeling of strange familiarity. What do you personally think that binds the cities around the Mediterranean rim the most? Are we aware of each other's existence, or do we still keep looking to the West as a point of reference to understand one another, and especially referring to that imperial heritage here? And what kind of common grounds are there already available to us on which we can build further upon? And I'm asking this question to you in the hope that you respond to it as a Beiruti, from that specific lens, if you will, but also from a personalized perspective.
First, let me say wow about your essay, and I'd love to hear the whole piece. Actually, it's simply beautiful. You refer to Beirut a bit the same way I thought of Istanbul the first time I visited it, except I was really jealous. I didn't just like it. I grew up thinking that that story about Beirut being the Paris of the Middle East and being between East and West and being so hybrid, and I loved the city and how much it could provide this hybridity. And then when I visited Istanbul, I was devastated. I was like, oh my God, this is like 100 times more hybrid. This is 100 times more contradictions and connections and so much magic, really, that I think is the topic of places that are built over time with so many layers. Istanbul, of course, being much richer and much larger than Beirut, but these are cities that, as you point out rightfully, are not produced through an exercise of top-down planning that can reveal them relatively easily. There are cities in which you peel layers, you uncover stories, and every production of a corner is the stories of many peoples and interests and stories and quarrels and invented, what you call them, sort of plots that actually end up producing the places. And they resist, in that sense, the cleanliness of capitalism and the abstract space it creates, if one is to use Lefebvre and think with it. And I think that does their charm, and their appeal, because they allow us as humans not to also resist the being controlled and monitored by the strict rules of the law. And here you asked me to be personal, and again, I'll be personal. Every time I try to decide that Lebanon was unlivable and I am going to take my family and we're moving to the US, and as you know, my partner is American, my kids are not even Lebanese, our law does not allow us to pass on citizenship as mothers. So every time I've carried that, we've decided to move. After a few months, it became unbearable and we had to come back. And I think it was at that point that one begins to ask, like, what is it that despite the comfort, the beauty, the cleanliness, the ease of everyday life in the cities of the West, I feel the need to be here? And I think it is essentially that unscripted everyday process in which there's so much room for negotiation, perhaps a little bit less than right now would be great though. But but where you still have room for negotiation, where you can exist as an individual, not simply as a subject of the law, but really as someone who can negotiate one presence and exist in a community that I have found to be incredibly important. And projecting on other cities of the Mediterranean in the south, whether it's Alexandria or Istanbul that I've visited, or even Marseille, I have to reclaim it as a little bit like us. There is that dimension that allows people to exist and to interact outside what is legal and what is not, as with more spontaneity, perhaps. That for me, and really this is very unscientific, right? It's from an N equal 1 and talking to friends that I find to be very important. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but.
It definitely does in a very beautiful way. I think that's the feeling, that's the sense of attachment and how we feel about our cities, our countries, and even though there are these difficulties and moments, and then you just simply have to be here. And
yes,
and
not
then,
ask yourself that question,
yeah.
right?
Yeah,
Why
and then I guess what we should do more often is that as the people who feel this way, pretty much the same way, I guess, that to look, I mean, at each other more often and to connect, in different ways, to be engaged more within among each other, as well as we do it to other places and the so-called models that are the West and whatever countries they are. So thank you very much, Muna. I really appreciate it. I think it's been, and we've been in, we kept our promise about time as well. Very disciplined scholars, I guess, two of us. So I'd like to open the floor now to questions from our audience. If they can please use the question and answer option, they can see on their screen. And then I'll be reading them to you. I'm sure you'll be seeing them too, but I think because of the YouTube live stream, I'd better read them out loud as well.
Right.
So yeah, anybody who wants to ask the first question, I know it's a difficult task, and I didn't prepare any other question aside from my questions to make the start. So someone else have to do it.
We can give 30 seconds, and if not, I can ask you a question.
Okay, sure. All right. Okay. Emre is pasting on the chat because he couldn't answer, reach the Q&A option. So, okay, I'm reading it for you. I'm sure you're seeing that too, but for our audience as well. In one of your recent talks, you mentioned the importance of not losing sight of the policy tools at the disposal of local or national authorities, while at the same time acknowledging the importance of bottom-up politics and citizen-led action. Can you talk a little bit about why it is important to pay attention to both of these? Thank you, Andrew.
Yes, I think you're referring to the big discussion that happened possibly in Colombia. That was one of the moments where I felt really upset when one of the colleagues that I enormously admire put forward the idea that we should, as planners, let people live their lives and maybe perhaps stop pretending like we can make a difference. And while I fully respect the fact that people should be allowed to live their lives, I feel that that there's nothing more unequal, and here I'm paraphrasing, of course, there's nothing more unequal than the equal treatment of unequals, right? So we are not creating a plain level field in our cities. Our cities are designed in a way that make it very hard for people to access shelter, to be able not only to imagine how the cities should be, but to also transform them, change them. and be able to shape them in ways that can also respond to their needs. That's why I feel that it's a very easy way out for us to position ourselves with residents as if we are the same. And I think that there's privilege that comes with the kind of education that we have, with the power that's given to our voice as university professors, as planners, that we have to use to create a more leveled field. And this is where I feel we need to intervene. And one of the things that I feel is really important is that we put in the realm of possibilities that there can be tools that can make a difference, and that tools can be different, that the city does not have to be the way it is, and that if we only look 30, 40 years ago, things weren't the way they are today. So when I talk about vacancy at this moment in Lebanon and the necessity to introduce a vacancy law, I talk about the right of people to be able to occupy those houses that are empty in the city legally without being criminalized. And I think that this is a policy that even a government that's completely bankrupt can enact because it costs them $0. But that's not something that will be in the realm of someone working from their neighborhood trying to improve their everyday life and struggling. That's something I can see because I can survey the city as a scholar. So this is, I guess, just one example I'm trying to give about the ways in which we can use our position to sort of influence public policy making and intervene on the policy framework. There are tons of other rules, value capture taxations, inclusionary housing, that are very useful tools that should be put in the realm of possibilities of citizens in many cities around the world. And that's our, I think that's where I feel that we have to be able to do that. Now we do that, but we also have to be in conversation with people who are trying to design their everyday life inside neighborhoods, and that we can build on the knowledge they have and complement it. So we don't exist on our own. We're not experts who should be telling them what they should be doing. We know this has failed, but we can't also just pretend that we're just another city dweller. I think this is really what I mean when I say that we have to use our planning tools.
Thank you, Mona. Do we have any other questions from our listeners, attendees, as Zoom labels them?
We can also think about since we're thinking about these cities in the region, we can think about how cities react in moments of disaster. Izmir has been through a massive earthquake. We were all seeing the news. I think there's a lot of similarity in the way in which city dwellers run immediately after a blast or an earthquake or a hurricane. And how there are these emergence of solidarity in which alternative possibilities are actually set in place, right? This moment of exception that the blast creates, and I wonder if you can speak a little bit to that. I'm actually very curious, Kıvanç. I feel that the moment of the explosion creates a destabilization that pushes people, at least for a short window, to reconsider what is important before sort of things get back into their normal mode. And one wonders, what can we take from these moments of exception that we can learn, that we can actually adapt and keep beyond the moment of exception? So I wonder if you can speak to that. And I know it's a super difficult question.
Yeah, well, I've been thinking along the same lines, similar questions whenever these things happen and the way we react to them, you know. I don't know if this is something specific to our cities only, but assuming that they are to some extent, how can we make them kind of permanent states rather than, you know, the way we organize and the solidarity and the way we handle things and help each other? How can we make the extended, as you were saying, beyond those moments and making it sort of a state of being for our reaction to things? I guess those are the moments where people feel kind of, they take initiative and their agency. I mean, they don't think really about the authority, about what people say. They immediately, instinctively behave and act as they are and they feel. And maybe we should be able to do that more often in a more, I guess, we should understand how this happens and then practice this, obviously, not waiting for a disaster to happen to create those kind of moments or live through them. Yeah, I mean, so I think there are many similarities, although, yeah, I mean, I guess this could be happening similarly in different places, so I can't really speak about that for sure.
But look at what the crisis does. I mean, look at the COVID crisis, forget the explosion. Suddenly, if you look at the UN rapporteur review of what countries have done, you find that most countries around the world have frozen eviction. They have prevented banks from recovering houses where mortgages are unpaid during the crisis. So they've lifted the rules of the market and recognized that there's a human emergency that's higher. Could that be extended? I mean, can we build on this and say, look, they were able to do it during the pandemic. This should extend beyond the pandemic, particularly in contexts where large companies increasingly own large stocks of housing that they rent out. So we're not talking about the old Beirut scenario where one person builds a 3-floor buildings, two floors that they live in and the 3rd floor that they rent out. And that's their sort of old age insurance. We are shifting to cities where wealth is more concentrated, property is more concentrated. And so that rental can become then a way of redistribution. And so I think we have plenty of opportunities right now that we can learn from, and that maybe beginning an exercise of thinking about who can recover it beyond, like beyond the crisis would be really important.
Yeah, exactly. When you think of how people share their apartments, open them up to, people affected by the earthquake more than themselves. There were talks about let's revive this idea of social housing we built in the 70s, which were distributed, allocated through rental rather than, I mean, this municipality would own them and then, rent them out really in affordable prices to people rather than pushing for home ownership and all that story, that governed our lives in the last 20, 30 years, I guess. So those kind of, these come about and talked more actively because that are happening in practice, how people are sharing and supporting each other. And these should be pushed as an agenda, perhaps before or without any disasters happening, coming our way, I guess. Perhaps a more concrete answer to your question from my end. Okay, I guess we're having a shy crowd today. Not really receiving any questions, guys. We'll about to end in 5-10 minutes. So if you have anything to ask and say and comment on, please do so using the Q&A box below the screen.
There are still big differences between the countries, right? I mean, Turkey has had a tradition of public housing policy, of informal settlement upgrading, of municipalities and central state agencies intervening on the housing market, and really playing more the role of a nation state that provides housing than Lebanon has. I think there is this particularity to Lebanon, where housing, although it's recognized legally as a right in many international treaties that Lebanon has signed, we continue to fail to sort of converge towards a national housing policy or to provide the direction in which either local or central state authorities play any kind of role. Lebanon has never had any informal settlement upgrading, so it's more of a context in which people are left to their own device. There's been a few efforts in recent years, in part by international organizations like UN Habitat, to sort of coach the Lebanese government into encouraging a public housing policy, and I think this is very welcome. But you continue to be in negotiation with public sector agents who have a hard time thinking that this is their role, and who somehow think that the market should take charge. So the ideology is very, very strong, and I think this is something that that requires deep changes in the politics before it can translate really into public policy.
Yeah, and I guess we have a lot to learn from each other in terms of the different modes of governance and the new trends in governance, I would say, in the last 10, 20 years. And in some countries, when you're looking for a government, in some countries you have too much of it, right? So you're like trying to sort of get the ways that people deal with the housing crises and how we can push and negotiate with authorities to have you know, more affordable housing options that are not in fact disguised under the sort of, you know, that they're actually tools for urban developments, and they're not really social housing, but they're packaged like social housing in different contexts. So yeah, I totally agree with you, and I hope that these kind of initiatives and organizations, events like Roof Design Izmir, would be platforms more actively used and populated by the people around the Mediterranean, and sharing their experiences and expertise and ideas and forms of activism and initiatives that they've been taking on. I think we won't have any questions other than Emre's question, and I really thank you for this conversation. I've really enjoyed it. I miss you. I miss all my colleagues, and say hi to all of them, please, on my behalf.
Beirut misses you in more words than I can say.
Okay,
really.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Make me really happy. So, unless we have any other comments from any other
I do
attendees,
see a hand raised.
Do we?
Actually.
Okay, thank God. There is a chat box. There is another one. Yes, Elif. Okay, great. A couple of them actually that popped up in the last few minutes, I think. All right. So first of them from Ayşegül Sabuktay. It's a pleasure to listen to Mona FAWAZ in Good Design Izmir. Could we have something shared more between Beirut and Izmir in the future in terms of design and community? I guess projects and ideas. There is a question from Emre about Beirut Urban Lab and the projects after the blast. I think you answered that to some extent. And the third one, well, let me let you answer the first two, and then I'll come to the third one.
I mean, as you pointed out, I mean, in terms of doing something between Izmir and Beirut, or between our respective institutions, usually it's easier. Of course, we are open. We would love to. Having now Kıvanç there is certainly a massive incentive to do it. So hopefully something will materialize and will be imagined. In terms of the work that the Beirut Urban Lab has been doing since the explosion, I had already touched on this a little bit. I can say very briefly sort of the three directions that we took in our work. The first direction that we took was to try and set an observatory of the recovery. For us, that is very important. It's a scientific exercise that we wanted to do already before the blast. We strongly feel that the Beirut port explosion is an accelerator and not a new event, and that most of the things that are being pointed out as severe problems pre-exist the blast, or at least create very deep fragilities in the city that need to be documented. So over the last 4 months, we've been working with 6 wonderful young people in 6 neighborhoods of Beirut, where we have been documenting at the scale of the neighborhood, the history, the processes, and the way in which they are ingrained with the recovery, by way of pulling out as scholars sort of indicators that we will be following through over the coming year at least, to show how the neighborhoods are recovering from a perspective that's invested in an understanding of shared open spaces, homes, businesses, and their interaction together in the making of neighborhoods and actors who play roles in these neighborhoods. So that's one work, sort of this observatory of the recovery. The piece of it that's simply about documenting the destruction of the blast, we did it very quickly in partnership with the Order of Engineers and Architects, and to whom we lent a lot of our support to make it happen, but also with Rice University that had a fantastic infrastructure of mapping. So we worked together and sought to upload as much as possible using everything that is out there in Open Map Lebanon. The disasters, they're available if you're interested. The second track that we launched is a track about visioning. And then what we said is Beirut is not the only city that has gone through this. So we've picked 8 major themes that we think are critical: what you do with the port, what you do with heritage, what you do with housing, what you do with urban connections, with international funds that are set up for post-disaster recovery. And for each one of those, and in partnership with Columbia World Project and JSAP in Colombia, who are our partners, particularly Professor Heba Bouakar, we have set up 8 sessions, 8 discussion sessions, where each one brings about 20 people from all over the world who have gone through similar experiences to discuss what they have learned and how they've done it. And you end up with sort of a space for learning from others and getting pathways or entry points, and then that can empower you to engage further in those conversations over time, but that really allow you to see outside of your own case study. And that's been really important because it works in parallel with what is being done at the Order of Engineers and Architects, which is much more an exercise of engaging in Beirut the local planners and architects. So we're hoping to sort of cross these two, and today we were discussing how we can do that and bring partners on board so that we can really set together that general vision for how the recovery should happen. And the last direction is to really go down to the neighborhoods, to really try to emulate that idea of post-disaster recovery and not reconstruction, working from neighborhoods with residents in a way that can set in place a process of long-term rehabilitation, recovery, repair, in which residents of neighborhoods can guide and inform and be partners in the process. And I think this is really important. Honestly, it sounds like textbook, but every time you talk to anyone who has been part of a successful post-disaster recovery, whether it's in Puerto Rico or in Surat in India or elsewhere, you consistently hear that the balance between expert resident needs to be 80-20, and the 80 is for the residents. And short of having people on board, the post-disaster recovery will end up at best being something about returning to the status quo before, considerably weakened. So when your status quo before is really uninspiring, as was the case in Beirut, we really hope that we can do more and really begin to trigger different imaginations for what the reconstruction should be.
Thank you, Mona, for this answer.
And if I can just say that we have some information on our website, not enough, but if you go to beiruturbanlab.org, I think it is, I'll check it out now as we're speaking. You can see more about those projects.
Okay, yeah, we'll share the website with our attendees as well, in case they're interested. I have third and I think our last question that I've received about the role of authority in design decision processes related to urban issues, and I would like to add to that question, perhaps, you know, the times when city planning discipline was more popular. I mean, in Turkey, for instance, we have a lot of city planning departments, but the kind of, you know, the role they played in states planning institutions and everything was diminished throughout the years because of the privatization and other things that states are not doing the things they used to do in the 50s and 60s and 70s. So how can we rethink about this? I mean, the issue of authority and the design decision processes, and how can we reinsert ourselves into this? I mean, we talked about this a little bit today, but relating to this question, I want to bring it out again and perhaps end with your another positive note. Today's talk.
I think that we started, and if you think about comprehensive planners in the 1900s, or the first planners who were sort of coming into cities, they used their common sense. They were all men, they were all white, they thought they had rules, they really cared about order, and they set up in place planning processes that were very top down, that used the terms like science, but in practice really implemented a lot of biases. And while there was something inspiring about that imagination that there can be a common good and a custodian of the common good in the form of the state that can guide the planner, the practice was that the common good was really reduced to the perspective and vision of small cliques of men. And I think in those games, the planners were not as powerful as they thought they were in reality. But they did give a very bad name to the profession and allowed for between Marxist critiques first, and then the entire dark side of planning tradition to look back at planning and say, you guys displaced people in the name of development and did not really create redistributive growth. You guys built dams that demolished livelihoods and found that certain communities consistently that were more vulnerable, poorer, people of color, women could be sacrificed to that grand project of development that you thought. And so that critique was very well placed. The problem is that as it gained momentum, it happened at the same time that we also had the onslaught of privatization and neoliberalism. And so it worked against instead of questioning the authority of that scientific approach, what we questioned is the entire edifice of planning. And with it, we threw away the idea that there can be such a thing as a collective common good in the name of which the cities should be designed. And I think that what we've learned today is that the only way in which that collective common good can be constructed is through incremental, bottom-up, participatory processes, as dépassé and sort of old-sounding they may seem. They are still the recipe for bringing people on board and giving a sense that it's not just your interest that is at stake. And I think we are facing now the devastation across the globe that the rule of the market has produced, and that we are ready to reconsider in many, many places for many, many communities that principle. What role can design play in this process? I think design thinking, the process in which we think outside the box, we construct incrementally, not out of recipes and pre-designed order, but creatively and collaboratively, futures that can be as inclusive as possible, experimentally, needs to be recovered. And that's something designers are good at. The other thing that can really be recovered is the exercise of visioning. And again, it's not Le Corbusier's vision of how people should be living in a cité radieuse that turned out to be extremely dim, but actually the exercise of imagining processes that people can discuss. We were listening to Alejandro Aravena a couple of days ago, describing how they did it in Chile in the post-disaster recovery. And he said, we listened for 20 days, and for 80 days, we just put forward proposals. And you know what he said? He said, we didn't whine, we refused to whine. The only discussion that was acceptable was one about proposals. Destroy them, demolish them, critique them, do anything you want, but in relation to a project that can then be owned and developed and improved by people. And I think these are some of the things that we have as tools that we can recover from our professions that are very hopeful. And I don't know, I believe in them. I think they provide us with a good way to start. They're definitely not foolproof, but they provide us with a good place to start if we want to think of something different from where we are.
Okay, one last question, final last question popped up before I ask you the last one. Elif is asking, how would you evaluate the role of pride in common practices within a city? Belonging, I mean, doing things together, this kind of creating that feeling of, you know, commonality.
I think it's incredibly important.
Yeah.
I think this is incredibly important. I think that that's the collective we were talking about. It's that shared feeling that you're part of something and that you believe that you're in that collective. And I think that the assumption was that the state would be the custodian of the common good and that you would trust the state. I think we've been failed in many places. And I think that what we're looking for now are different ways. I strongly believe in urban citizenship. I strongly believe that people who share a same space can recover some of the aspects of the political by working together to improve the places in which they are. I lived a lot of this throughout the years of civil war in Lebanon, whether it's at the level of the building or the neighborhood, where we had to organize ourselves so that our lives would be bearable. And I think that this can have the potential to develop if it's protected. We saw informal settlements around the world in the 1960s develop into neighborhoods that were very livable and actually often become places that are desirable, that respond to people's needs. That was the time when people like John Turner and others were going in these neighborhoods and celebrating them as a solution to the housing problem. And as of the 1980s, things began to change because these neighborhoods could no longer grow and become viable housing options because everywhere else land became impossible to access. So they started densifying and deteriorating. And eventually there was so much pressure put on them to be the recipients of every single vulnerable population in cities that the pride of place was lost and it became shameful to be part of living there. And you sort of can see this in so many cities around the world. So the projects of neighborhoods that could have been built bottom up, supported, enhanced, serviced, became dramatic stories of collective failure. And so I think we really ought to reinvest in this. And that, unfortunately, for better or for worse, even though as scholars, we know that states are one form in which societies have organized themselves over history and that they're barely 150 years old and they definitely will not last much more, but that right now this is the best thing we have. So we have to work through our political systems to improve our cities. But definitely, I think that there's hope there more than in any other place to create collective places that can be worked.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mona, again. Thank you all our attendees and participants who asked their questions. Again, it's been a great pleasure having you here, listening to you. I think we've learned a lot from this conversation. So I'm particularly happy that you took your time to join us and share with us your ideas and experience through different institutions and personally as well. Emre, do I give the floor back to you now? What do I do?
Yes, I can take it from there.
Okay, go ahead, please.
It was a delight to listen to you both. Thank you very much for being part of our program this year. The recording of this session will be available on YouTube. So we had some problems on YouTube today because the Google was down, but it will be fixed. So for those who missed the opportunity, they will have an opportunity to listen to it again. Thank you very much. It was a fantastic conversation. Thank you. And thanks to Kıvanç for moderating it with his wonderful questions. We'd like to kind of continue our collaboration in some way or another through the Mediterranean Academy, hopefully in the future.
Look forward to more. Thank you so much for inviting me. It was a true honor to have this conversation, to catch up a little bit with Kıvanç, and to be part of this wonderful event. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye, guys. Thank you.
Just the last word for those who will be around tomorrow. We have a session early in the morning about collaborative action and collaborative approaches in design education. So we will hope to see you at 1 o'clock tomorrow. Thank you very much. Have a good evening. Bye.